The fire that killed me still tasted like ash on my tongue when my eyes snapped open. I wasn't choking on smoke. I was sitting on a hard plastic chair that smelled of ammonia and cheap floor wax. Across the table, my twin sister's eyes were wide, frantic, and burning with a greed I recognized intimately. She lunged across the desk, grabbing the old woman's wrinkled hand. "I'll stay with Grandma," she screamed. She remembered too. And she had just made her biggest mistake. The fluorescent light above the lawyer's desk emitted a high-pitched, incessant hum. It vibrated in my teeth, a sharp contrast to the roaring inferno that had consumed my reality just seconds or perhaps a lifetime ago. I blinked the dry, air-conditioned air stinging my retinas. My hands resting in my lap were small, unscarred. The burn tissue that had fused my fingers together in my final moments was gone, replaced by the soft, unblemished skin of a 16-year-old. I was alive. The realization didn't come with a triumphant swell of music. It came with a wave of nausea so violent I had to swallow back bile. "I'll stay with Grandma," Charlotte shrieked again, her voice cracking with an artificial hysteria that made my skin crawl. Her fingernails dug into the sleeves of Grandma Ruth's moth-eaten wool cardigan. "I belong with family. I won't let her go to a home, Mr. Finch. I'll take care of her." Mr. Finch, a public-appointed attorney who smelled faintly of old peppermint and exhaustion, blinked behind thick spectacles. He looked from Charlotte's tear-streaked angelic face to mine. I was silent. I was still trying to convince my lungs that the air wasn't turning to poison. In our past life, I was the one who had cried those tears. I was the one who had clung to Ruth, driven by a naive, crushing sense of familial duty. I had let Charlotte take the golden ticket, the adoption papers from the Whitmire family, a dynasty of old money and sprawling estates. Charlotte had climbed into the back of a sleek, black town car and disappeared into a world of silk and privilege, leaving me to the crushing poverty of Ruth's decaying farmhouse. But Charlotte hadn't known how to handle the Whitmires. She had thought wealth was a blanket you just wrapped around yourself. She didn't see the strings. When their empire began to fracture, they used her as collateral, marrying her off to a man whose cruelty was a well-documented whisper in high society. Meanwhile, I had bled into the dirt of Ruth's barren acreage. I had worked 3 jobs, paid the suffocating back taxes, and eventually uncovered the lithium deposit sitting quietly beneath the dead soil. I built an empire with calloused, bleeding hands, and then Charlotte came back, enraged, debt-ridden, and blaming me for the disparity in our lives. She locked the doors of my warehouse. She struck the match. Now, staring at her desperate grip on Ruth, I saw the truth. Charlotte remembered. She thought the old woman was a magical piñata, a guaranteed shortcut to billions. She thought the land simply turned to gold on its own. "Well," Mr. Finch said, clearing his throat and shuffling the thick stack of manila folders, "this is highly unusual. The Whitmire estate explicitly requested one of you for their guardianship program. Philanthropic endeavor. Usually siblings fight over the placement. I don't care about their money." Charlotte sobbed, burying her face in Ruth's chest. Ruth patted her awkwardly, her pale, watery eyes narrowing at me. Ruth didn't love us. We were burdens left behind by a careless daughter. She was probably already calculating how much state assistance Charlotte could bring in. "And you, Neera?" Mr. Finch asked, his voice softening with pity. He thought I was being abandoned. "Are you amenable to the Whitmire placement? It means leaving your grandmother, leaving your sister." I looked at Charlotte. She peeked out from Ruth's shoulder, a venomous, triumphant smirk flashing across her face before vanishing back into a mask of devotion. She thought she had won. She thought she had stolen my crown. "I'm fine with it," I said. My voice was a rasp, rough, and entirely devoid of emotion. Charlotte's shoulders relaxed. The tension leached out of the small, suffocating office. Finch slid a document across the fake wood grain of his desk, tapping a designated line with a cheap ballpoint pen. "Sign here, Naira. The Whitmire representative is waiting in the lobby." I picked up the pen. The plastic felt cheap, fragile in my grip. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look at Ruth, who was already complaining about her joints, or at Charlotte, who was staring at me with hungry, predatory anticipation. I signed my name. "It's done," Finch said, stamping the paper with a heavy final thud. I stood up. My knees shook. The cotton of my faded dress scratched against my thighs. I turned toward the door. "Naira," Charlotte called out. I paused my hand on the cold brass of the doorknob. "I hope you find what you're looking for with those rich people. Just remember, money isn't everything." The hypocrisy tasted like rust. I didn't turn around. "Enjoy the farm, Charlotte," I said softly. "Make sure you check the foundation for termites before winter." I opened the door and walked out into the sterile, buzzing hallway of the municipal building. The air was colder here. Sitting on a leather bench checking her phone with sharp, impatient swipes of her thumb was Diana Whitmire. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Ruth's entire property valuation. Her blonde hair was pulled into a severe, immaculate twist. When she heard the door click, she looked up. Her eyes, the color of winter ice, scanned me. She was assessing a purchase. She took in my scuffed shoes, my thin frame, the dark circles under my eyes. "Naira," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmire." "Diana," she corrected, standing up. She smelled of juniper expensive gin and pressed linen. "Grab your bag. The driver is waiting in the loading zone. We have a 3-hour drive ahead of us, and I abhor traffic." She didn't offer a smile. She didn't offer a comforting hand. I felt a strange, dark sense of relief wash over me. In my past life, the lack of affection would have crushed me. Now it was oxygen. There was no pretense here, no fake familial warmth to decipher. Just a transaction. I picked up my canvas duffel bag. It held exactly 3 pairs of jeans, a handful of shirts, and a toothbrush. I slung it over my shoulder and followed her out the glass doors into the blinding afternoon sun. I was walking into the lion's den entirely alone. But the lions didn't know I had already died once, and I wasn't planning on doing it again. The interior of the Jaguar was a sensory deprivation chamber. The thick tinted windows muted the outside world into a silent, blurry film. The cream leather seats were so soft they felt like human skin yielding under my weight, but offering no actual warmth. For 2 hours the only sound was the low, engineered purr of the engine and the rhythmic tapping of Diana's manicured fingernail against the screen of her tablet. I pressed my temple against the cool glass, watching the scenery shift from dilapidated strip malls and cracked asphalt to dense, looming forests and wrought-iron gates. My heart maintained a slow, heavy rhythm. The trauma of the fire still flickered at the edges of my peripheral vision. If I closed my eyes for too long, I could smell the melting plastic, feel the blistered heat searing my lungs. I dug my fingernails into my palms until the sharp sting anchored me back to the present. "You're very quiet," Diana noted, not looking up from her screen. "I don't have anything to say," I replied, keeping my gaze on the passing trees. She stopped tapping. I felt her eyes on the side of my face. "Your file said you were the difficult one. Prone to arguments, stubborn. My file was written by a social worker who met me for 15 minutes while I was trying to stop my sister from cutting her own hair with kitchen shears." The words came out flat, stripped of the defensive anger the 16-year-old Naira would have used. Diana let out a small, breathy sound. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was an acknowledgement. "We chose you because of the optics, Naira. I won't lie to you. The Whitmire name has taken a battering in the press lately. I knew. Oh, I knew. Embezzlement rumors, a factory collapse overseas, a messy public lawsuit. They needed a distraction, A heartwarming story of old money taking in an orphaned girl from the Rust Belt. You will be enrolled in St. Jude's Preparatory. Diana continued, her voice slipping back into its detached boardroom cadence. You will be provided with an allowance, a wardrobe, and tutors to bring you up to the academic standard we expect. In return, you will attend Galla's Smile for the cameras and refer to us as your benefactors. You will not cause trouble. You will not embarrass my husband, and you will stay out of my son's way. Do we have an understanding? You want a prop? I said. I want a return on my investment. Understood. She finally looked at me, really looked at me, a flicker of genuine curiosity breaking through her icy veneer. You aren't what I expected. I grew up fast today. The car turned off the main highway tires, crunching onto a sweeping, crushed gravel driveway. The trees parted to reveal the Whitmire estate. It was a sprawling 3-story limestone monstrosity, complete with imposing colonnades and meticulously manicured hedgerows. It looked like a museum. It looked like a mausoleum. As the car pulled to a stop in front of the sweeping mahogany double doors, I noticed the subtle signs of decay. The paint near the upper eaves was peeling. The fountain in the center of the roundabout was dry, the marble cherubs stained with dried algae. The Whitmires were bleeding cash, bleeding influence, and hiding behind an imposing facade. In 2 years, the creditors would start circling. In 3, the estate would be auctioned off. I stepped out of the car. The air here was thinner, smelling of damp earth and crushed boxwood. A man in a tailored, albeit slightly frayed uniform opened the heavy front doors. Take her bag to the East Wing guest room. Diana ordered, breezing past him without a glance. Noira follow. I walked into the foyer. The temperature plummeted. The floors were a stark checkerboard of black and white marble echoing with every step. Above, a massive crystal chandelier hung like a suspended threat, catching the late afternoon light and throwing fractured rainbows across the dark oak paneling. I followed Diana up a sweeping, grand staircase. My cheap sneakers squeaked against the polished wood, a sound that felt violently loud in the cavernous silence of the house. Dinner is at 7. Sharp, Diana said, stopping abruptly in front of a heavy white door at the end of a long, portrait-lined hallway. Do not be late, and please, try to look presentable. The housekeeper left a dress on the bed for you. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic retreat. I pushed the door open. The room was massive, larger than the entire first floor of Ruth's farmhouse. It was suffocatingly beautiful. Silk draperies, a massive canopy bed piled high with down comforters, an antique vanity with a spotless mirror. It was perfect. It was cold. I dropped my duffel bag on the floor. I didn't walk to the window to admire the view of the sprawling gardens. I didn't throw myself onto the soft mattress. I walked over to the adjoining bathroom, turned on the brass faucet, and watched the water run. I gripped the edges of the marble sink, staring at my reflection. Pale skin, dark hair, eyes that looked too old for the face they belonged to. The panic, the sheer crushing weight of having to live an entire life over again, suddenly hit me. My chest tightened. The air grew thin. I slid down the wall, hitting the cold tile floor, and pulled my knees to my chest. I let myself break, but only for exactly 3 minutes. I timed it by the steady dripping of the faucet. I allowed the tears to fall, allowed the terror of the flames to wash over me, allowed the grief for the life I had built and lost to momentarily shatter me. When the 3 minutes were up, I stood up. I turned off the water. I splashed my face, drying it with a thick, monogrammed towel that scratched slightly against my cheek. Charlotte wanted the dirt. She could have it. She could break her back trying to figure out how to squeeze water from a stone. I was in a sinking castle, but I had the blueprints and I knew exactly where the lifeboats were kept. I walked back into the bedroom and looked at the dress laid out on the mattress. It was navy blue, high-collared and stiff, the uniform of a well-behaved prop. I stripped off my cheap cotton clothes and put it on. It fit perfectly, a physical manifestation of the cage I had just walked into. I zipped it up, smoothed the fabric, and waited for the clock to strike 7. The dining room was a masterclass in psychological intimidation. The table, a massive slab of polished mahogany, could comfortably seat 20. Tonight it was set for 4. The lighting was dim, cast by silver candelabras that smelled faintly of beeswax and old silver polish. When I entered precisely at 7, the room was empty, save for a young man slouching in a high-backed chair at the far end of the table. He was tapping a heavy silver spoon against the rim of his crystal water glass. Clink, clink, clink. Conrad Whitmire. He was 17 tall, with the same icy blonde hair as his mother, though his was artfully messy. He wore a crisp white button-down sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing the face of a watch that cost more than I had made in a decade of my first life. He didn't stop tapping the glass when I walked in. He just tracked my movement with eyes that were bored and cruelly intelligent. "So," he drawled, his voice carrying easily across the expanse of the room. The charity case actually showed up. I didn't break stride. I pulled out the chair directly across from him, ignoring the 2 seats set closer to the head of the table. The wood scraped loudly against the floorboards. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and looked at him. "I prefer tax write-off," I said evenly. "It sounds more professional." The spoon stopped tapping. Conrad blinked, a flicker of surprise breaking through his manufactured apathy. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You've got a smart mouth for someone wearing my mother's idea of a doll's dress." "It's a very nice dress," I replied, my tone conversational deadpan. A bit restrictive around the ribs, but I assume that's to keep me from eating too much of the food. He stared at me. In my previous life, Charlotte had told me stories of Conrad. He was a terror, vicious, entitled, and deeply insecure beneath the bravado. He had tortured Charlotte, exploiting her desperate need to belong, setting traps for her at social events, mocking her lack of etiquette. Charlotte had cried. She had thrown tantrums. She had played perfectly into his hands, becoming the chaotic, ungrateful orphan he wanted her to be. I wasn't Charlotte. I was a 34-year-old woman who had negotiated land rights with cutthroat oil executives, trapped in the body of a teenager. A spoiled rich kid with a silver spoon was a vacation. The heavy doors opened again, and Diana walked in, followed by a man I assumed was Adrian Whitmire. He looked tired. The skin around his eyes was grey, and his suit hung slightly loose on his frame. He carried the distinct scent of scotch and underlying panic. "Conrad, sit up straight," Diana snapped as she took a seat at the foot of the table. Adrian took the head. The geography of the table placed me and Conrad as opposing forces in the center. "Nearer," Adrian said, his voice a rumbling baritone that lacked any real warmth. "Welcome to our home. I trust Diana has explained the arrangements." "She was very thorough, Mr. Whitmire," I said. A maid silently entered through a swinging door carrying a silver tureen. She began ladling a thick, pale soup into our bowls. The smell of truffle and heavy cream wafted up. It was rich, cloying. Conrad picked up his spoon, his eyes locked on mine. "Be careful, Naira. That's vichyssoise. I know you're probably used to eating out of cans, but you're supposed to eat it from the side of the spoon, not slurp it." Diana paused, her spoon hovering over her bowl. She was watching me, waiting to see how the prop reacted to being poked. I looked down at the soup. I picked up my spoon. I didn't touch the liquid. I looked back up at Conrad. "Vichyssoise is traditionally served cold, Conrad," I said quietly. The room was so silent, my voice seemed to echo off the dark wood paneling. "This is steaming. Given the smell of the truffle oil, which is a cheap synthetic masking agent, and the broken consistency of the cream on the surface, I'd say the kitchen is rushing. Probably because the household staff hasn't been paid on time this month, leading to a severe lack of morale in the kitchen." The silence that followed was absolute suffocating. Adrian's spoon dropped into his bowl with a loud clatter. Diana's face drained of color, her icy eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock. Conrad's mouth opened slightly, the smirk completely obliterated. I calmly dipped my spoon into the bowl, skimming the edge, and took a small sip. "It's a bit salty," I noted. I set the spoon down and dabbed my mouth with the linen napkin. I knew about the staff wages. In the financial post-mortem of the Whitmire Empire, I had read out of morbid curiosity in my past life. The delayed payroll was the first domino to fall. It was public record 5 years from now. Right now, it was a fiercely guarded secret. "How?" Adrian started, his voice trembling slightly. He looked at Diana, who looked back at him with a mirrored expression of panic. Observation. I lied smoothly. "People who are paid well don't burn the butter. People who are anxious do." I picked up my water glass and took a sip. The cold crystal felt grounding against my lips. I looked at Conrad. He wasn't looking at me with mockery anymore. He was looking at me like I was a live explosive that had just been set on the dining room table. "I think," I said, my voice gentle, almost reassuring, "we should all just eat. It's going to be a long evening." I cut into the tension with the precision of a scalpel. I didn't need them to love me. I didn't need to fit in. I needed them to fear me just a little bit, to understand that I wasn't prey. Somewhere miles away, I knew Charlotte was likely sitting at Ruth's wobbly formica table, eating boxed macaroni and cheese, breathing in the smell of stale cigarette smoke, waiting for the ground beneath her to spontaneously turn to gold. She thought she had left me to the wolves. She didn't realize I already knew exactly how to bite. The uniform of St. Jude's Preparatory was a study in sensory torture. The pleated wool skirt dug a permanent red line into my waist, and the starched collar of the Oxford shirt felt like a dull blade resting against my throat. I stood in front of the massive oak doors of the main hall, breathing in the scent of lemon pledge old paper and the suffocating cloud of designer aerosol deodorants. Teenagers. Hundreds of them. The hallway was a chaotic current of hormonal energy and casual cruelty. Lockers slammed with the concussive force of gunshots. Laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings, sharp and performative. At 34, I had forgotten the sheer exhausting volume of youth. Now, trapped back inside a 16-year-old body, the noise made a dull headache pulse behind my right eye. I kept my head down, clutching a leather-bound schedule that felt entirely too heavy for the 3 pieces of paper it contained. I didn't look up to meet the stares. I could feel them, though, prickling against my skin like static electricity. The charity case. The stray dog the Whitmires had dragged in from the mud. "Don't trip." The voice was low, spoken directly over my shoulder. I didn't flinch. The smell of spearmint gum and something distinctly metallic like keys left out in the cold gave him away before he spoke. "Conrad?" I glanced sideways. He was walking beside me, his stride impossibly long, his tie loosened to a degree that practically screamed manufactured rebellion. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking straight ahead, offering a tight, patronizing nod to a group of boys leaning against the water fountain. I have a fairly decent center of gravity. I replied, my voice a flat monotone beneath the roar of the hallway. "They're looking at your shoes," he said. "They're standard issue. The school provides them for scholarship kids. Everyone here wears custom loafers. It's like a neon sign." I looked down. My black Oxfords were stiff and heavily lacquered, lacking the soft, worn-in matte finish of the shoes around me. In my past life, I would have burned with shame. I would have spent weeks saving up lunch money to buy the right pair, desperate to blend into a background that actively rejected me. Now I just felt a mild annoyance at the lack of arch support. "Noted," I said. "I'll try not to let their judgment scuff the cheap leather." Conrad let out a sharp exhale through his nose. Not a laugh exactly, but a break in his polished armor. Since the dinner with the Vichyssoise, our dynamic had shifted into a bizarre, tense purgatory. He hadn't mocked me again. He hadn't set any traps. Instead, he watched me, like a kid poking a strange bug with a stick, waiting to see if it would sting or play dead. "Library is at the end of the hall, take a left," he said suddenly, peeling away toward a classroom. "Don't sit near the radiators. They leak." I watched his retreating back for a fraction of a second before continuing my march. The library was exactly what I needed. It was a cavernous space smelling deeply of decaying bindings and dust mites. The silence here was enforced, heavy and thick. I found a computer terminal tucked away in a shadowed corner far from the hissing iron radiators. The keyboard was sticky. I woke the monitor, the harsh blue light washing over my face. I didn't open the school portal. I didn't check my syllabus. My fingers moved with the muscle memory of a woman who had spent a decade staring at market fluctuations and geological survey reports. I opened a private browser and pulled up the county tax records for the agricultural district where Ruth lived. There it was. Plot 402, 60 acres of dry, useless dirt. The property taxes were 3 years delinquent. The total owed was a little over $14,000. In my past life, it had taken me 4 years of waitressing, scrubbing toilets, and saving pennies in a mason jar to pay it off just weeks before the county auctioned it. I leaned back in the plastic chair, rubbing the bridge of my nose. The squeak of the chair's hinges sounded unnervingly loud. Charlotte was sitting on that land right now. She knew it held value, but her memory of our past life was fractured, driven by emotion rather than data. She didn't know what was in the ground. She just knew I had gotten rich off it. She was probably out there with a shovel looking for a chest of gold doubloons, completely ignorant of the subterranean brine reservoirs, rich in lithium. But ignorance wouldn't stop the county from foreclosing, and once it went to public auction, a corporate surveyor would snap it up in an instant. I needed $14,000. Actually, I needed $50,000 to establish a shell LLC and buy the land outright from Ruth before she croaked or the state seized it. I looked down at my hands. Small, callus-free, empty. I closed the browser, the screen going black, reflecting my own pale, exhausted face back at me. I was a minor. I had no credit, no capital, no legal standing. If I wanted the dirt, I was going to have to squeeze the blood out of the stone I was currently living in. The Whitmire estate was entirely different at 2 a.m. The sprawling house settled the old wood, groaning like the ribs of a dying ship. The temperature dropped significantly, the drafts sneaking past the heavy velvet curtains and crawling across the marble floors. I walked down the second-floor hallway in my socks. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, distant ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer. I wasn't sneaking exactly. I just didn't see the point of announcing my presence. I stopped outside the heavy mahogany double doors of Adrian Whitmire's study. A thin slice of yellow light bled from underneath the threshold. The smell of expensive peaty scotch and stale cigar smoke hung heavy in the air. He was awake. He was always awake these days. I knocked once, a solid single rap of my knuckles against the wood. There was a muffled curse, the sound of glass clinking against glass, and then a rough, "What is it?" I opened the door and slipped inside. The study was a monument to masculine insecurity. Dark, leather dead animals on the walls, shelves of books whose spines had never been cracked. Adrian sat behind a massive desk, his tie undone the top button of his shirt, open, exposing the graying hair on his chest. His face was slack, the skin under his eyes bruised purple with exhaustion. A half-empty decanter of amber liquid sat next to a glowing laptop. When he saw me, his brow furrowed in deep, slow confusion. He blinked, trying to bring me into focus. "Naira." He slurred slightly, dragging a heavy hand down his face. "What are you doing? It's the middle of the night. Is there an emergency?" "For you, yes," I said. I walked forward. The Persian rug absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I stopped directly in front of his desk. I didn't ask to sit. Adrian's eyes narrowed. The haze of alcohol pulled back just a fraction, replaced by the instinctual defensiveness of a cornered animal. Go to bed, young lady. We do not do this in this house. You are currently reviewing the Q3 logistics reports for Whitmire Maritime. I said, ignoring his dismissal. I looked at the spreadsheet visible on his laptop screen. The red cells were glowing like warning beacons. Specifically, the bleeding contracts in the South American shipping lanes. You're trying to figure out how to cover the margin calls before the board meets on Tuesday. Adrian froze. His hand, which had been reaching for his glass, stopped dead in the air. The silence in the room was sudden, violent. It was the sound of a man realizing the walls of his fortress were made of paper. How? He swallowed hard. The smell of fear suddenly overpowered the scotch. How do you know that? Because your CFO is an idiot, Adrian. I said, my voice completely stripped of any teenage deference. It was the voice I had used to fire contractors twice my age. Cold, factual, immovable. He locked you into fixed-rate fuel contracts right before a geopolitical crisis spiked crude prices. You're hemorrhaging cash on every cargo ship that leaves port. And you're hiding it from Diana. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked at me as if I had just peeled off a human mask to reveal something monstrous underneath. His hands began to shake. A fine, uncontrollable tremor. It wasn't a triumphant sight. It was pathetic. A grown man, a titan of industry, crumbling under the weight of his own incompetence in front of a 16-year-old girl. A knot of disgust and pity tightened in my stomach, but I pushed it down. Empathy was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. Who sent you? He whispered, his voice cracking. Is this a setup? Did the board put a wire on you? Nobody sent me. I live down the hall. I said. I placed my hands flat on the edge of his desk, leaning in. Listen to me very carefully. You are 3 weeks away from a catastrophic default. When the board finds out, they will strip you of your title, freeze your assets, and the resulting panic will drop the stock price by 40%. You will lose this house. You will lose the cars. Diana will file for divorce before the ink is dry on the SEC investigation. He squeezed his eyes shut. A small, pathetic whimper escaped his throat. The reality he had been drowning in scotch had finally caught him. I can fix it, I said. His eyes snapped open, bloodshot and wide. You're a child. I am a solution, I corrected. I know exactly which subsidiary is holding liquid assets that haven't been audited yet. I know how you can restructure the debt through a shell corporation in Delaware to buy yourself 6 months. 6 months is enough time to dump the toxic shipping contracts onto a competitor who is looking to expand their fleet blindly. I rattled off the names, the numbers, the exact legal loopholes. I had studied the Whitmire collapse in my past life as a cautionary tale of corporate hubris. I knew their books better than their accountants did. As I spoke, the color slowly returned to Adrian's face. The panic was replaced by a desperate, hungry, calculating gaze. He was a drowning man, and I had just handed him a jagged, rusty piece of driftwood. He didn't care if it cut his hands. He just needed it to float. Why are you telling me this? He asked, his voice steadying the executive persona clawing its way back to the surface. Because I live here, I said simply. And I don't want to pack my bags yet. And he wasn't entirely stupid. He knew a transaction when he saw one. And I continued, standing up straight. I want a custodial brokerage account opened in my name by tomorrow afternoon, completely autonomous. No oversight from you, no alerts sent to your phone, and I want $50,000 deposited into it. Adrian scoffed a wet, ugly sound. 50 grand, that's extortion. That is a consulting fee. I countered. 50,000 to save a $400 million empire. If you think that's too expensive, I can go back to bed, and you can explain the margin calls to the board on Tuesday. I held his gaze. I didn't blink. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to grow louder, filling the space between us. He looked at the red numbers on his screen. He looked at the bottom of his empty glass. Then he looked at me. Tomorrow afternoon. He rasped the defeat heavy on his tongue. I'll have my personal banker set it up. Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Whitmire, I said quietly. I turned and walked out of the room, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. As the latch clicked into place, my knees buckled slightly. I leaned against the cool wood of the hallway paneling, taking a deep, shuddering breath. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was done. I had the seed money. The dirt was mine. I pushed off the wall and walked back to my room. The air in the house still felt freezing, but for the first time since waking up in that plastic chair at the lawyer's office, I felt a tiny flickering ember of warmth in my chest. The Whitmire estate had a rose garden in the back that Diana treated with more reverence than her own family. It was a sprawling, manicured labyrinth of deep reds and pale pinks, smelling so intensely sweet it bordered on rot. I was sitting on a cold wrought-iron bench, hidden behind a massive trellis, the screen of my newly acquired burner phone glowing against the fading evening light. The custodial account was active. The transfer had cleared 2 hours ago. My fingers traced the edges of the cheap plastic phone casing. I had the money. Now I needed to bait the trap. I dialed the number for Ruth's farmhouse. The line rang 3 times, accompanied by a heavy wash of static that spoke of decaying copper wires and unpaid utility bills. Click. What? Charlotte's voice. It wasn't the sweet, tearful tone she had used in the lawyer's office. It was sharp, exhausted, and tinged with an underlying current of frantic panic. Hello, Charlotte, I said. My voice was calm, a stark contrast to the thrumming adrenaline in my veins. A sharp intake of breath on the other end. Naira, taking a break from sipping tea with the 1% to check on the peasants. I could picture her. Standing in the cramped kitchen that smelled of boiled cabbage and mold, her hands probably raw from washing dishes in water that barely got lukewarm. She had traded a golden cage for a muddy grave, all because she thought she knew the ending of the story. Just checking on Grandma. I lied smoothly. I heard a rumor she was struggling with the property taxes. We're fine. Charlotte snapped instantly. The defensiveness was palpable. The farm is fine. Everything is going perfectly. Actually, I was out in the north pasture today, doing some surveying. My grip on the phone tightened. The north pasture. That was exactly where the highest concentration of the brine reservoirs sat. She was looking in the right place, but with the wrong eyes. Surveying. I kept my tone light, mildly amused. Planning on growing corn in dead soil, Charlotte. That's ambitious. You don't know anything. She hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She was probably checking to make sure Ruth wasn't hovering nearby. I know there's something out here. I remember things you did. You got lucky, Naira. But I'm here first this time. I'm going to find it. She was digging. Literally digging in the dirt. My chest seized with a sudden dark urge to laugh. She thought wealth was a buried treasure chest. She didn't understand the years of geological testing, the millions required for extraction machinery, the chemical processing. She thought she could pull a lithium empire out of the ground with a rusted shovel. Find what Charlotte oil. I let a trace of mockery bleed into my voice. The county mapped that land 30 years ago. There's nothing under there but limestone and regret. Shut up! She yelled, the veneer cracking completely. You're just jealous. You're terrified I'm going to take what's mine. I found a soft spot in the ground today. It smells strange, like metal. I'm telling you, I'm close. A soft spot. A seep. If she ruptured a brine pocket near the surface without containment, she'd poison the meager well water Ruth relied on. If you say so. I said, my voice turning cold. But you might want to focus on the tax bill before you start digging oil wells. The county sent a final notice to my old forwarding address. You have 30 days before it goes to public auction. Silence on the line. I could hear her breathing short and shallow. She hadn't known. $14,000, Charlotte. I added softly, twisting the knife. I'm sure you can dig that up by the end of the month. I hung up. The screen went black. The heavy scent of the roses seemed to press in on me, suffocating and thick. I rubbed my thumb over the screen, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. I had planted the seed of panic. Charlotte would be desperate. She would try to sell off equipment, maybe even try to mortgage the house, but she had no credit. When the auction hit, she would be completely powerless to stop it. And I would be waiting. You're smiling. I flinched, my shoulder blades hitting the iron back of the bench with a painful clack. Conrad stepped out from the shadows of the trellis. He was wearing a dark sweater blending almost perfectly into the gathering twilight. In his right hand, a cigarette burned the cherry a bright, angry orange in the gloom. The smell of tobacco cut through the cloying sweetness of the flowers. He didn't ask to sit. He just dropped onto the bench next to me, leaving a foot of space between us. He took a drag of the cigarette, exhaling a thin stream of grey smoke into the night air. I wasn't smiling, I said, slipping the burner phone into the pocket of my cardigan. You were... He countered, not looking at me. He stared straight ahead at a marble statue of a weeping angel. It was a terrible smile. Looked like a shark deciding which limb to bite off first. He took another drag. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken questions. He had been standing there long enough to hear my side of the conversation. He knew I was applying pressure to someone. My father looks like he swallowed a ghost today, Conrad said quietly, his voice lacking its usual sarcastic bite. He cancelled his golf game, locked himself in his office with the lawyers. The household staff actually got their back pay deposited this afternoon. The chef was crying in the pantry. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the glowing tip of his cigarette. Conrad finally turned his head, his pale eyes catching the moonlight. He looked tired. He looked like a kid who knew the walls of his house were rotting, but couldn't figure out where the termites were. You've been here 3 days, he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. You wear cheap shoes, you know how to read a balance sheet, and you make phone calls in the dark to threaten people about property taxes. He leaned in slightly. The smell of mint and tobacco washed over me. What the hell are you, Nira? I met his gaze. I didn't look away. The vulnerability in his eyes was real, a crack in the arrogant facade of the Whitmire heir. In my past life, he had broken Charlotte because she tried to be something she wasn't. I wasn't going to make that mistake. I'm the girl who just bought the lifeboat, Conrad. I said, my voice barely a whisper. I suggest you learn how to row. I stood up, leaving him alone on the bench, the smoke curling around him as the darkness finally swallowed the garden. The Oakhaven County Courthouse smelled of wet wool, cheap floor wax, and generations of quiet desperation. It was a brutalist concrete block, entirely devoid of natural light, lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. I sat in the very back row of the gallery, the hard wooden bench digging into my spine. I wasn't alone. Conrad sat next to me, his long legs cramped against the pew in front of us. He wore a dark wool coat, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He hadn't asked questions when I told him I needed a ride out of the city limits at 6 a.m. He just tossed me a spare helmet, fired up a vintage Triumph motorcycle he kept hidden in the estate's carriage house, and drove us 3 hours through the biting autumn frost. My thighs were still vibrating from the engine. You're shivering, he murmured, not looking at me. It's the air conditioning. I lied. It wasn't the cold. It was the adrenaline thick and metallic in the back of my throat. Down in the front row, huddled together like survivors on a raft, were Charlotte and Grandma Ruth. Charlotte looked entirely undone. The pristine, angelic veneer she had weaponized in the lawyer's office was gone. Her hair was greasy, pulled back into a messy knot. She wore one of Ruth's oversized flannel shirts, and even from 40 feet away, I could see the nervous tremor in her hands as she shredded a paper tissue into tiny white flakes. She had brought Ruth, a last-ditch effort to play on the sympathy of the county clerk. It wouldn't work. The county didn't care about weeping grandmothers. They cared about delinquent accounts. At the podium, a bored-looking auctioneer in a shiny, poorly fitted suit adjusted his microphone. Next item, Parcel 402, 60 acres agricultural zoning. Starting bid covers the tax, lien, and municipal penalties, $14,200. Charlotte let out a sound, a high, thin whine that was instantly swallowed by the indifferent murmur of the room. She didn't have a paddle. She didn't have a dime. Do I have 14-2? The auctioneer droned. A man 3 rows ahead of me raised a numbered piece of cardboard. A local developer probably looking to clear the land for cheap tract housing. 14-2. Do I have 15? Down the aisle, leaning casually against the back wall, stood a man named Gable. He was a bottom-tier corporate attorney I had hired over the burner phone yesterday for a flat fee of $500. He represented Aegis Holdings LLC, a shell company registered in Delaware, funded by the $50,000 Adrian Whitmire had bled into my account. Gable raised his hand. 15. Charlotte whipped her head around, scanning the room frantically. Her eyes swept right past me and Conrad, landing on Gable. The raw hatred on her face was almost startling. She was watching her phantom gold mine slip through her fingers, completely powerless to stop it. 16. The developer countered. 20. Gable said, not missing a beat. The developer paused, turning to look at Gable. He was doing the math in his head. The land was dead. The soil was acidic. For a housing development, it would require thousands in leveling and soil remediation. He lowered his paddle. 20,000 going once. The auctioneer chanted, his voice a flat, rhythmic hum. Going twice. Bang! The wooden gavel hit the sounding block. The sound cracked through the stuffy air like a rifle shot. Sold to the gentleman in the back for 20,000. A physical weight vanished from my chest, so sudden and absolute that I slumped slightly against the hard wood of the pew. I owned it. The dirt, the rocks, and the massive, silent ocean of lithium brine sleeping beneath it. It was mine. Again. In the front row, Charlotte broke. She didn't cry elegantly. She screamed, a raw, ragged sound of absolute denial. She lunged over the wooden barrier separating the gallery from the municipal floor, grabbing the edge of the clerk's table. "No, you can't take it, it's mine!" She shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the concrete walls. "There's something in the ground. It belongs to me." 2 court bailiffs immediately stepped forward, grabbing her by the arms. Ruth sat in her chair, staring straight ahead, completely detached, her mouth set in a hard, bitter line. "Get off me!" Charlotte thrashed, kicking at the bailiff's shins. As they dragged her backward, her eyes raked wildly over the crowd. And then she saw me. I hadn't moved. I was just sitting there, staring back at her. The frenzy in her eyes stuttered to a halt, replaced by a sudden, chilling clarity. She looked from me to Gable, who was already packing his briefcase, and back to me. She saw the absolute lack of surprise on my face. She knew. She didn't know how, and she didn't know the mechanics of my shell company, but she knew I had orchestrated the very thing she thought she was doing to me. She had been playing checkers while I was laying down a minefield. "Naira!" She screamed, the sound tearing at her vocal cords. You did this! You stole it from me!" The bailiffs hauled her through the heavy double doors, her screams fading into the corridor. The gallery settled back into its bored, apathetic silence. The auctioneer cleared his throat and moved to the next parcel. Conrad shifted next to me. The heavy wool of his coat brushed against my arm. That was ugly. he said quietly. Poverty usually is. I replied. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, but my mind was completely, terrifyingly clear. Let's go. I have homework to do. We walked out of the courthouse, bypassing the screaming match Charlotte was currently having with the bailiffs on the front steps. Conrad handed me the helmet. I strapped it on the leather cold against my chin. As the motorcycle roared to life, vibrating through my bones, I looked back at the courthouse one last time. In my past life, I had died smelling smoke. Right now, all I smelled was exhaust and the sharp, clean scent of the incoming winter. Life at the Whitmire estate shifted imperceptibly in the weeks following the auction. The massive limestone mansion still felt like a mausoleum, but the ghosts were suddenly taking orders from me. Adrian avoided me entirely. If I walked into the dining room, he would suddenly remember an urgent phone call. If we crossed paths in the sweeping, checkered foyer, his eyes would dart to the floor, his shoulders hunching defensively. I had saved his empire, but I had stripped him of his illusion of control. To a man like Adrian, that was a fate worse than bankruptcy. Diana, however, was a different breed of predator. She didn't know about the margin calls, and she didn't know about the $50,000. But she smelled the shift in the power dynamic. I was sitting in the solarium on a Tuesday afternoon, a heavy textbook resting on my lap. The air in the glass-enclosed room was humid, heavy with the scent of blooming orchids and wet soil. Diana walked in her heels, clicking sharply against the terracotta tiles. She held a crystal tumbler of sparkling water, the ice clinking against the glass. "Adrian is terrified of you," she said, bypassing any pretense of greeting. She stood silhouetted against the afternoon sun, a severe, immaculate shadow. I didn't close my book. I kept my finger marking the page on macroeconomic theory. "Adrian is terrified of his own shadow, Diana. I just happened to turn the lights on." She took a slow sip of her water. "I don't like mysteries in my own house, Neera. You arrived here a month ago in a dress from a discount rack. Now my husband jumps when you clear your throat, and my son, who hasn't spoken to a human being without a layer of irony in 5 years, acts like your personal chauffeur. Conrad likes the excuse to ride his motorcycle." I countered smoothly. Diana stepped closer. The smell of her juniper perfume momentarily overpowered the orchids. "We took you in to be a prop, a smiling face for the cameras. You haven't smiled once. You want to smile." I finally looked up at her, letting the cold, flat exhaustion of a 34-year-old woman bleed into my eyes. "Point a camera at me, and I'll give you a smile that will make the board of directors weep with joy. I'll play the grateful orphan perfectly. But when the cameras are off, I suggest we keep out of each other's way. I am the only reason your husband hasn't packed a suitcase and fled to a non-extradition country. You should be thanking me." Diana's face tightened. A muscle in her jaw twitched. She wasn't used to being spoken to this way, let alone by a teenager. But she was smart. She saw the truth sitting in the absolute lack of fear in my posture. She turned on her heel and walked toward the glass doors. "Dinner is at 7. She said, her voice brittle. "Don't be late." She left. The heavy silence of the solarium rushed back in. I exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of my nose. Managing the Whitmires was exhausting, but it was necessary. They were my cover. As long as I was the ward of a billionaire family, no one looked too closely at the teenage girl moving assets through a Delaware shell company. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It wasn't the burner. It was the sleek smartphone Diana had issued me. A text from Gable Drilling Permits cleared. Geological team moves on to the site tomorrow morning. My pulse spiked. It was beginning. The extraction process. That night I couldn't sleep. The phantom burns came back. It happened sometimes when the stress peaked. I lay in the massive canopy bed, staring at the dark ceiling, feeling the ghost of the heat blistering the skin on my forearms. I squeezed my eyes shut, digging my fingernails into my palms until the pain grounded me. I threw off the heavy down comforter and walked to the window. The estate grounds were bathed in pale moonlight. Down below, sitting on the edge of the dry stone fountain, was a glowing red ember. Conrad. I pulled on a heavy wool cardigan over my pajamas and walked softly down the grand staircase. I slipped out the side door, the freezing night air hitting me like a physical blow. The frost crunched under my bare feet, biting into my skin, but I didn't care. The cold felt good. It meant I wasn't burning. I walked over to the fountain and sat down next to him. He didn't flinch. He just held out the pack of cigarettes. "I don't smoke," I said, pulling my knees to my chest to conserve heat. "You look like you need to start," he replied, taking a drag. The cherry illuminated his sharp cheekbones, the deep, exhausted shadows under his eyes. "You were breathing so hard when you walked out here I thought you were having a heart attack." "Bad dream," I muttered. "About the sister?" he asked. I looked at him. "Why would you say that?" he shrugged, tapping the ash onto the frozen marble of the fountain. "Because since that day at the courthouse you've been vibrating, like a wire pulled too tight. You won, didn't you? Whatever game you were playing with her, you bought the dirt." "I bought the dirt," I confirmed softly. "Then why do you look like you're attending a funeral?" The question caught me off guard. It bypassed the corporate armor, the cynical teenager act, and struck the very core of the contradiction I had been carrying since I woke up in Mr. Finch's office. "Because," I said, my voice barely a whisper in the vast, empty darkness of the estate. "Winning doesn't unburn the house down, Conrad. It just means you own the ashes." He stopped smoking. He looked at me, really looked at me, the sarcastic defense mechanisms entirely stripped away. For a fleeting second, in the cold dead of night, we weren't a billionaire's heir and a parasitic charity case. We were just two people sitting in the wreckage of a family, trying to figure out how to breathe the smoke. "Well," Conrad finally said, his voice rough. He flicked the cigarette butt onto the frozen grass and crushed it with the heel of his boot. "If you ever need help sweeping up the ashes, let me know." It was the closest thing to an alliance I had ever been offered. I didn't say thank you. I just nodded, the cold seeping into my bones, anchoring me to the present. 6 months later, the roar of the diesel engines was deafening. It rattled my teeth and shook the ground beneath my heavy steel-toed boots. I stood on the edge of Plot 402, a hard hat strapped to my head, a high-visibility vest draped over my tailored jacket. The 60 acres of dead, useless farmland were gone. In their place was a sprawling, mechanized beast of industry. Massive drilling rigs punched deep into the earth. Miles of thick industrial piping snake across the dirt, pumping the subterranean brine into massive open-air evaporation pools. The water in the pools was a stark, unnatural turquoise, glowing fiercely under the midday sun. The smell of the place was aggressive. Diesel exhaust turned earth and the sharp metallic tang of heavy salts. It smelled like money. It smelled like the future. I held a clipboard reviewing the preliminary extraction yields. The lithium concentration in the brine was even higher than in my previous life. The geological surveying team Gable had hired was ecstatic. We were sitting on one of the most concentrated deposits in North America. In a year, Aegis Holdings would be worth hundreds of millions. In 5 years, billions. "Excuse me, Ms. Whitmire." I turned. The site foreman, a burly man with a thick beard coated in grey dust, was pointing toward the chain-link perimeter fence we had erected around the property. "There's a girl at the gate," he yelled over the roar of the generators. "Says she knows you, won't leave. Security was about to call the local cops." My grip on the clipboard tightened. "I'll handle it," I said, my voice flat. I walked away from the evaporation pools, the crunch of gravel loud under my boots. The closer I got to the gate, the quieter the machinery seemed, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thudding of my own heart. Charlotte was standing on the other side of the heavy wire mesh. If she had looked ruined at the courthouse, she looked entirely hollowed out now. Her clothes hung off her frame. Her skin was sallow. her eyes ringed with deep purple bruises of exhaustion. She had her hands curled into the chain-link fence, the metal biting into her pale skin. She wasn't screaming today. She wasn't manic. She just looked at the massive industrial complex behind me, her eyes tracking the pipes, the rigs, the turquoise pools of brine. I stopped 3 feet from the fence. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stood there, letting the reality of what she had traded away crush the remaining oxygen from her lungs. "It wasn't gold," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, broken. She didn't look at me. She just stared at the pools. "I dug up the north pasture for weeks, until my hands bled. I thought it was gold, or oil, but it was just mud, lithium." I said, my voice carrying easily across the short distance. "It's a brine aquifer, 400 feet down. You can't reach it with a shovel, Charlotte. You need capital. You need infrastructure." She slowly turned her gaze to me. The sheer, unadulterated tragedy of her mistake was etched into every line of her face. She had chosen the farm because she remembered my wealth, but she lacked the fundamental understanding of the work, the suffering, and the intelligence it took to pull it from the earth. She thought success was a destination you could just walk into. "You knew," she rasped, a tear finally breaking loose and cutting a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. "When we were in that lawyer's office, you knew what was under here. You let me take it." "No," I corrected softly, the scent of the diesel exhaust mixing with the memory of the fire. "I let you make a choice. You chose greed. You chose to abandon me to the Whitmires because you thought it was a shortcut. I just adapted." She gripped the fence harder, the knuckles turning white. "I have nothing, Naira. Ruth passed away last month. The state took whatever was left to cover her medical debts. I'm living out of my car, please." The plea hung in the air, pathetic and raw. In my past life, I would have broken. I would have opened the gate. I would have brought her in, given her a job, given her a piece of the empire, only to have her burn it to the ground when she felt overshadowed. But I wasn't that girl anymore. The fire had burned away the naive, suffocating loyalty that had tethered me to her. I looked at her hands, the dirt ingrained in the cuticles. I looked at the tears tracking down her face. I felt a profound, heavy sadness, not for the girl standing in front of me, but for the sister I had loved in a life that no longer existed. "I'm sorry, Charlotte," I said. And the terrifying part was I meant it. I was genuinely sorry that she was broken, but I wasn't going to fix her. "This site is restricted. You need to leave before I have security trespass you." Her eyes widened in shock. She expected anger. She expected me to scream to punish her. She didn't expect the utter cold indifference. "Naira," she gasped, pressing her face against the metal mesh. "You're my sister." "My sister died in a fire." I said softly, the words barely audible over the hum of the distant rigs. I turned my back on her. I didn't walk fast. I didn't look over my shoulder. I walked back toward the turquoise pools, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, the sun beating down on my hard hat. I heard her sob, a broken, wretched sound, followed by the heavy thud of her hitting the dirt. I kept walking. The air was thick with the smell of the earth, of salt and of machinery. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't a fairy tale. I was entirely alone, standing at the helm of an empire built on the bones of a past life, wearing a high-visibility vest over a designer jacket in a world of cutthroat billionaires and toxic dirt. But as I breathed in the heavy industrial air, feeling the vibration of the drilling rigs vibrating through my spine, I realized one absolute truth. I wasn't choking anymore. If Naira's ruthless journey resonated with you, hit that like button to let the algorithm know you crave stories with real bite. Surviving a second chance isn't about being the hero, it's about being the one holding the matches. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a protagonist that doesn't apologize for their scars. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We have more deeply grounded cynical. and emotionally raw stories coming your way every single week. Drop a comment below. Would you have opened the gate for Charlotte?